Buenos días, damas y caballeros, hermanos y hermanas. Es un placer para mí por primera vez en mi vida dar una conferencia a una audiencia en Perú. Lamentablemente, nunca he tenido la oportunidad de visitar su país. Esta primera conferencia de apologética en Perú es muy importante. Estamos aquí para ayudar al pensador a creer y ayudar al creyente a pensar. Mucha gente hoy se imagina que el cristianismo es anti-intelectual y no tiene respuestas reales a las grandes preguntas que surgen en las mentes de los jóvenes en particular. Esta conferencia demostrará que hay respuestas que hacen que el cristianismo sea creíble. Pero, hermanos y hermanas, tengo ahora que cambiar en inglés porque he olvidado casi todo mi castellano. Perdones. The new atheism is no longer new, but mainly through the writings of Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, it has been very influential. In a lecture at the Lausanne Conference in South Africa, social scientist Greg Pritchard said that unbelief, atheism and agnosticism, was the fastest growing religion in the 20th century. In 1900, 90% of the atheists in the world lived in Europe. By the year 2000, more than 80% of these atheists lived in other parts of the world. Unbelief, which started as a uniquely European belief system, has now become a worldwide tidal wave. These atheists influence a much larger group of agnostics towards unbelief. In 1900, there were less than 1% atheists and agnostics in the world, and by 2000, this had risen to more than 15% of the world's population, nearly 1 billion people. Pritchard went on to say that the Enlightenment's disease of unbelief has now infected the world. The developing world has already caught the deadly European spiritual virus of unbelief. Europe is only the first casualty in the world to unbelief. The gospel's greatest competitor is unbelief, and unbelief is winning. Pritchard says that in order to deal with this, we need to learn some lessons from the early church. Firstly, the early Christians out-thought their contemporaries. Secondly, the early Christians taught the truth and refuted falsehood. And thirdly, they lived lives consistent with their faith in Christ. We need to do the same today. Ideas of consequences. And the new atheism has deeply influenced contemporary thought. For instance, there's a widespread impression fostered by people like Hawking and Dawkins that science has made faith in God impossible. Indeed, the new atheists plan to eliminate belief in God by using the cultural authority of science. Steven Weinberg, Physics Nobel laureate, has said that the world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization. We should note in passing that rather sinister-sounding totalitarian element. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold should be done. This attitude is not new. I met it 50 years ago as a student in Cambridge. On one occasion, I found myself at dinner, sitting beside a Nobel Prize winner. I'd never met a scientist of such academic distinction before, and I did what I have found it most useful to do in order to gain the most from conversations. I started asking questions. I asked him how his science shaped his worldview, his big picture of the status and meaning of the universe. In particular, I was interested in whether his wide-ranging studies had led him to affirm the existence of God. He was clearly not comfortable with the question, and I immediately backed off. However, at the end of the meal, he invited me to come to his study. He had also invited 2 or 3 other senior academics. I was asked to sit, and so far as I recall, they remained standing. He said, "Lennox, do you want a career in science?" I said, "Yes, sir." Then he said, "In front of witnesses tonight, you should give up this childish faith in God. If you don't, then it will cripple you intellectually and you will suffer by comparison with your peers. You just won't make it." Talk about pressure. I'd never experienced anything like it. I felt someone paralyzed, shocked at the effrontery and unexpectedness of the onslaught. I didn't really know what to say, but eventually I managed to blurt out, "Sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I have already got?" In response, he mentioned the book Creative Evolution, written in 1907 by the French philosopher Henri Bergson. In fact, thanks to C.S. Lewis, I knew a little about Bergson, and I said that I could not see how that his philosophy was enough to base an entire worldview on and provide a foundation for meaning, morality, and life. I told the group standing round me on that evening that I found the biblical worldview vastly more enriching and the evidence for its truth compelling, and so with all due respect, I would take the risk and stick with it. I did not know it at the time, but oddly enough, Bergson, a Jew, in later years moved towards orthodox views of God, and in his will of 1937 confessed that he thought that Catholicism was a fulfillment of Judaism, and he would have converted had it not been for an increasing wave of anti-Semitism in Europe. It was a remarkable situation. Here was a brilliant scientist trying to get me to give up Christianity by threats and bullying. I thought many times since that if it had been the other way round, and if I had been an atheist in the chair, surrounded by Christian academics pressurizing me to give up my atheism, it would have caused reverberations around the university and likely ended with disciplinary proceedings on the professors involved. That rather terrifying experience put steel into my heart. I resolved to do my best to defend Christianity against such misuse of science. The experience also taught me a valuable lesson about the existence of a dark side to academia. There are some leading thinkers who set out with preconceived ideas, do not really wish to discuss evidence, and are fixated not on the pursuit of truth, but on propagating the notion that science and God do not mix, and that those who believe in God are simply ignorant. They are wrong, very wrong. Think of the Nobel Prize in Physics, for example. Not long ago, it was won by Peter Higgs, a Scotsman who's an atheist. A few years before that, it was won by William Phillips, an American who's a Christian. If science and faith in God were incompatible, there would be no Christian Nobel Prize winners. The fact is that between 1900 and 2000, over 60% of Nobel laureates actually believed in God. You see, what divides Higgs and Phillips is not their physics. They both won the Nobel Prize. What divides them is their worldview. Higgs is an atheist and Phillips is a Christian. So the new atheists are simply wrong in saying that the conflict is between science and God. Richard Dawkins' claim that if you wish to be scientifically respectable, you have to be an atheist is obviously false. However, there is a conflict, and it's a very real one, not between science and God, but between the two worldviews held by these men. The atheistic worldview of naturalism or materialism, which are closely related to one another. Naturalism holds that this universe or multiverse is all that exists. Mass energy is the fundamental stuff and there's nothing else. Naturalism, as physicist Sean Carroll in his bestseller The Big Picture also tells us, we humans are blobs of organized mud, which through the impersonal workings of nature's patterns have developed the capacity to contemplate and cherish and engage with the intimidating complexity of the world around us. The meaning we find in life is not transcendent. The other worldview is theism, in my case Christian theism, which claims there is an intelligent God who created, ordered, and upholds the universe, and who created human beings in his image, with the capacity not only to understand the universe around us, but to get to know and to enjoy fellowship with God himself, so that life has a gloriously transcendent meaning. My own conviction as a scientist is that science strongly supports the existence of the God of the Bible, who has created the universe and who holds it in being by the word of his power. Let me now give some reasons for this. Firstly, from history. Modern science arose in the 16th and 17th centuries with pioneering geniuses like Galileo, Kepler, and Newton. They were all believers in God. Was there a connection between faith in God and the rise of modern science? The answer that most scholars give is that there was. C.S. Lewis put it this way: men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, when I put that to Richard Dawkins, he said it was not surprising that Galileo, Kepler, and Newton believed in God, since everybody believed in God in those days. However, Dawkins was wrong. He was thinking only of the West. China was different. For although China developed sophisticated technology, fireworks and printing, for example, the Chinese never discovered abstract science. Why was that? Chemist Joseph Needham at Cambridge was an expert in Chinese technology who wrote the definitive history of technology in that country. He was also a neo-Marxist and tried for years to explain why the Chinese did not discover abstract science. And even though he was a Marxist, he came in the end to the conclusion that what made the real difference was the fact that the Chinese lacked the idea of a single creator who had created the universe to run on fixed laws. So one of the reasons why I'm not remotely ashamed to be a scientist and a Christian is because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. Now we meet something odd that will help us understand what lies at the heart of the debate. Isaac Newton believed in God, and yet atheist Stephen Hawking, the world's best-known living scientist, who held the same Lucasian chair in Cambridge as did Newton, says that we must choose between science and God. How has that happened? How have we got from Newton's belief to Hawking's unbelief? So let's look at some very important principles. Firstly, we should note that statements of scientists are not necessarily statements of science. At the beginning of his famous TV series Cosmos, Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist, said, "The universe is all there ever was, all that is, and all that ever will be." That is a statement by a scientist, but it's not a statement of science. It's actually a statement of Sagan's atheistic belief. Second principle, scientists, even brilliant scientists, can talk nonsense. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman said once that outside his or her field, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy. And for example, Stephen Hawking in his book The Grand Design says, philosophy is dead, and it's now left to scientists to bear the torch of truth in our generation. It was very foolish to say philosophy is dead at the beginning of a book whose main topic is philosophy of science. It's also wrong to suggest that science is the only way to truth, a view that is widespread today and is called scientism. For if science were the only way to truth, you would have to get rid of half the faculties in any university. History, literature, language, and all the rest of them would go. Einstein once said that the scientist is a poor philosopher. Hawking, sadly, though a brilliant scientist, certainly demonstrates that. Second example of this is Dawkins' claim that God is a delusion. Here Dawkins, an ethnologist by training, is speaking outside his field. Delusion, after all, is a concept taken from the sciences of psychology or psychiatry. It means a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contrary evidence. Dawkins claims God is a delusion. I claim that it's Dawkins' atheism that is a delusion, a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contrary evidence. Now, since Dawkins is not a psychologist or psychiatrist, His claim that God is a delusion is not within the realm of his expertise. Now, I'm not a psychologist either. So the first question that we should ask is, what do experts in that field say about the effect of religious belief and spirituality? Do they support what Dawkins says? I find they do not. Andrew Sims, the past president of the Royal Society of Psychiatrists in England, writes, "The advantageous effect of religious belief and spirituality is one of the best kept secrets in psychiatry and medicine generally. If the findings of the huge volume of research on this topic had gone in the opposite direction, and it had been found that religion damages your mental health, it would have been front page news in every newspaper in the land." Furthermore, Sims tells us that a major survey in the American Journal of Public Health points out that in the majority of studies of this field, religious involvement is correlated with well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, hope and optimism, purpose and meaning in life, higher self-esteem, better adaptation to bereavement, greater social support, less loneliness, lower rates of depression, faster rates of recovery from depression, to mention just a few. But we read Dawkins' account in vain to find any awareness of this huge volume of research. Dawkins is actually trying to delude us. He claims to use science to make his point, but he does not realize that the science does not support him because he's not read it. That is not impressive. In his best-selling book, God, A Brief History of the Great One, German psychiatrist Manfred Lutz points out that this Freudian explanation for belief in God that Dawkins uses works very well, provided only that God does not exist. However, Lutz continues, by the very same token, if God does exist, then exactly the same Freudian argument will show you that is atheism that is the comforting delusion, the flight from facing reality, a projection of the desire not to have to meet God one day and give account for your life. For instance, Polish Nobel laureate for literature Czesław Miłosz, who had reason to know, writes this, "A true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death, the huge solace of thinking that for our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders, we are not going to be judged." Thus, if God does exist, then atheism can be seen as a psychological escape mechanism to avoid taking ultimate responsibility for one's own life. What Freud does not do is answer the key question whether God exists or not. Stephen Hawking was once asked what he thought of religion, and he gave a typically Freudian answer. Religion, he said, is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. I was asked to reply to that, what did I think of atheism? And so my Freudian reply was, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. A final example of scientists talking nonsense is the jibe that believing in God is like believing in Santa Claus. I've met this accusation in several university debates. On one occasion, I put it to the audience and I asked them to put up their hands if they had come to believe in Santa Claus as adults. No one did. But hundreds put up their hands when I asked for those who'd come to believe in God as adults. Putting God in the same category as Santa Claus is just foolish. So now we come to this question. Why does Hawking think that we have to choose between science and God? There are two main reasons. Two confusions, firstly about the nature of God, and secondly about the nature of science. I used to think that when I talked about God, people knew what I meant. The God of the Bible, the personal, intelligent, powerful creator and sustainer of the universe. Yet I find now that many of my atheist friends think that I believe in what is called the God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. The kind of thing the ancient Greeks believed in. Like the god of lightning. We can't explain lightning, so we invent a god of lightning to explain it. However, you soon find that that god is unnecessary when you do a bit of atmospheric physics. And there's a general idea today that the God of the Bible is just the same as the many gods of the ancient Near East, God of the gaps. Here's the important thing to understand. If you define God to be a God of the gaps, like that, a placeholder, an X that explains something that science has not yet explained, then of course you've got to choose between science and God, because that's the way you've defined God. You've defined God to be that which science has not yet explained. So of course you've got to choose between the two. But that is because your idea of God is false. Werner Jaeger, a world expert of the ancient Near Eastern gods in Oxford, points out that they had one thing in common. They were descended from the heavens and the earth, in the sense that those gods were products of the primeval chaos of mass and energy, and so they were essentially material gods. By contrast, Jaeger wrote that the God of the Bible, the Hebrew God, created the heavens and the earth. He was not descended from it. You see, the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. He's the God of the whole show. He's the God of the bits of the universe we don't understand and the bits we do. Genesis does not begin with the statement, in the beginning God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. Of course not. It starts with God, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That is the whole show. This has hugely important implications. When Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, now we've got a law of gravity, we don't need God. What he did do was write a book called the Principia Mathematica, the most famous book in the history of science. And he expressed in it the desire that he hoped that his calculations and observations contained within it would persuade a thinking person to believe in a deity. You see, like most normal people, the more you understand of something, the more you can admire it. The more you understand painting, the more you can admire the genius of Rembrandt, not the less. The more you understand engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls-Royce, not the less. And the more Newton understood of the glory of God and the workings of the universe, the more he admired the genius of the God who did it that way. Newton didn't see science as competing with God as an explanation. And that brings us to a key new atheist confusion about the nature of science. What does it mean to say that science explains? What does the law of gravity explain, for instance? One of the things I enjoyed doing was to show students how to derive the elliptical orbits of the planets from Newton's law of gravity. The law of gravity enables you to do brilliant mathematical calculations, accurate enough to enable a spacecraft to reach the moon. However, it took me some time before I realized that the law of gravity doesn't tell you what gravity is. In fact, nobody knows what gravity is. The philosopher Wittgenstein understood this very well when he said that the greatest deception of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature. They're not. They are just descriptions. The law of gravity doesn't take you a whit further towards an understanding of what gravity is, as Newton understood himself. So even at the first level, scientific explanation in terms of laws is not complete on its own terms without going outside of science. The next thing to realize is that scientific explanation is only one kind of explanation. Think of the question, why is the kettle boiling? Well, you say it's boiling because I've lit the Bunsen burner, heat energy is being dissipated through the bottom of the copper kettle and is agitating the molecules of water, making them move faster and faster and faster. That's why it's boiling. I say it's boiling because I want a cup of tea. That is, there are two explanations, rational explanations for the water boiling, a scientific one and a personal one. The important thing to see is that these two explanations are completely different, but they do not compete, nor do they conflict. They complement one another. Young people, even children, can understand this at once. And yet I find that some of the cleverest people do not seem to be able to see that scientific explanations about the way the universe works are not an argument against the existence of an intelligent God who designed it to work that way. Let me put it this way. God no more competes with science as an explanation for the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for an automobile engine. You need both. You need an explanation in terms of law and mechanism, the scientific one, and an agent explanation. They don't conflict or compete, they complement. So the new atheist's claim that God and science are incompatible is shown to be false. It arises from a misunderstanding of the nature of God and a misunderstanding of the nature of explanation. One of the questions I often get asked at this stage is this: if you believe that God created the world, then it is legitimate to ask the question, who created the creator? In fact, in his book, The God Delusion, this is one of Richard Dawkins' main arguments against the existence of God. If you believe that God created the universe, then you will have to logically ask who created God. However, it's easy to see that this is not really an argument at all. Think about it. If you ask the question, who or what created God, what are you assuming? You're assuming God was created. But what if he wasn't? The question wouldn't apply. It's as simple as that in a way. Because the God of the Bible wasn't created. He's eternal. So Dawkins' question doesn't even apply to him, let alone threaten his existence. Indeed, if Richard Dawkins' book had been called The Created God's Delusion, I suspect no one would have bought it, since anyone can see that created gods are a delusion. We've got a name for them. We usually call them idols. Dawkins' argument only applies to created things, so it applies to this universe. So I asked him, you believe the universe created you. Let me ask you your question. So who created your creator? I've been waiting at least 10 years and still have had no answer from him on that issue. Then there is confusion about the nature of faith. Professor Peter Singer is a world-famous ethicist from Princeton, an atheist whom I debated in his home city of Melbourne in Australia. In my introduction, I told the audience that I grew up in Northern Ireland, that my parents were Christians. Singer's reaction was to say that I was an example of his greatest objection to religion, that people remain in the religion in which they were brought up. And so religion is simply a matter of heredity and environment, not a matter of truth. I then said, Peter, I'm sure the audience would like to know about your parents. Were they atheists? He said, yes, they were. Oh, I said, so you remained in the faith in which you were brought up. But he said, it isn't a faith. Really, I said. I was under the impression you believed it. There was much laughter. Not only that, but cyberspace lit up with the question, doesn't Peter Singer, a philosopher, realize that his atheism is a belief system? Many leading atheists are similarly confused and as a result make absurd statements. Atheists do not have faith, says Richard Dawkins, and his book The God Delusion is all about what he has faith in, what he believes. Dawkins, like Singer, thinks that faith is a religious concept that means believing where you know there's no evidence. He's wrong. Faith is an everyday concept, which according to the Oxford English Dictionary is a word coming from the Latin fides, which means loyalty or trust. We don't normally trust facts or people without evidence. After all, making well-motivated, evidence-based decisions is just how faith is normally exercised. Think of how you get your bank manager to trust you, or the basis for your decision to get aboard an aircraft. Believing where there's no evidence is dangerous. It's what is usually called blind faith. And no doubt in all religions you will find adherents who believe blindly. I cannot speak for other religions, but the faith expected on the part of Christians is far from blind. The Gospel writer John says, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing in him you might have life in his name. You see, John is telling us here that his gospel contains the evidence on which faith in Christ can be based. We now ask the question, do atheists have faith? The new atheist confusion about the nature of faith leads them to another serious error, thinking that neither atheism nor science involves faith. Yet the irony is that atheism is a faith and science cannot do without faith. Physicist Paul Davies says the right scientific attitude is essentially theological. Science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. He points out that even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith the existence of a law-like order in nature that is at least in part comprehensible to us. And Albert Einstein famously said, "Science can only be created by those who are thoroughly imbued with the aspiration towards truth and understanding." This source of feeling, however, springs from religion. To this there also belongs the faith in the possibility that the regulations valid for the world of existence are rational. That is comprehensible to reason. I cannot imagine a scientist without that profound faith, said Einstein. The situation may be expressed, he went on, by an image. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Einstein evidently did not suffer from the new atheist delusion that all faith is blind faith. He speaks of the profound faith of the scientist in the rational intelligibility of the universe. He couldn't imagine a scientist without it. For instance, scientists believe or have faith that electrons exist and that Einstein's theory of relativity holds because these things are supported by evidence based on observation and experimentation. My teacher of quantum mechanics at Cambridge, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, said, "Physics is powerless to explain its faith." Note his explicit use of the word in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe, for the simple reason that you cannot begin to do physics without believing in that intelligibility. Now, the interesting question to probe is, on what evidence do scientists base their faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe that allows them and is essential for them to do their science? The first thing to notice is that human reason did not create the universe. This point is so obvious that at first it might seem trivial, but it's fundamental when we come to assess the validity of our cognitive faculties. Not only did we not create the universe, but we didn't create our own powers of reason either. We can develop our rational faculties by use, but we didn't originate them. How can it be then that what goes on in our tiny heads can give us anything near a true account of reality? How can it be that a mathematical equation thought up in the mind of a mathematician can correspond to the workings of the universe? It was this question that led Einstein to say the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Similarly, physics Nobel Prize winner Eugene Wigner once wrote a famous paper entitled "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences." But it is only unreasonable from an atheistic perspective. From the biblical point of view, it resonates perfectly with the statement, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him." Sometimes I ask a scientist, "What do you do science with?" "My mind," say some. And others who believe the mind is the brain say, "My brain." Okay then, I say, "Tell me about your brain. How does it come to exist?" "Well, by means of natural unguided processes through time." "All right," I say, "why then do you trust it? After all, if you thought that your computer was the end product of natural unguided processes, would you trust it? Of course not." And very often they say to me, "Where did you get this argument?" And I say, interestingly enough, I got it from Charles Darwin. who wrote, "With me the horrid doubt always arises, whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy." You can see the logic of that. John Polkinghorne says that if you reduce mental events to physics and chemistry, you destroy meaning. How? For thought is then replaced by electrochemical neural events. Two such events cannot confront each other in rational discourse. They are neither right nor wrong, they simply happen. The world of rational discourse disappears into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. Quite frankly, says Polkinghorne, that can't be right, and none of us believe it to be so. Philosopher Alvin Plantinga puts the Darwin's doubt argument this way: if Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief they produce, including Dawkins' own science and atheism. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Now, Plantinga is a Christian, but some leading atheists also see the problem. John Gray writes, "Modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth." Philosopher Thomas Nagel has written a book, Mind and Cosmos, with a provocative subtitle, "Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False." Now, Nagel is an atheist. He says, "I don't want there to be a God." Yet his view supports Plantinga. He says, if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism depends. That is, atheism undermines the foundations of the very rationality that is needed to construct or understand or believe in any kind of argument whatsoever, let alone a scientific one. Atheism is beginning to sound like one great self-contradictory delusion, a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence. Of course, I reject atheism because I believe Christianity to be true, but I also reject it because I'm a scientist. How could I be impressed with a worldview that undermines the very rationality I need to do science? Science and God mix very well. It is science and atheism that do not mix. There's another dimension to this debate, and that is the moral dimension. For the new atheists are not simply saying that God doesn't exist, but that belief in God is responsible for much of the violence in the world. And it's certainly true that suffering caused by religion is one of the worst kinds of moral evil. Indeed, Richard Dawkins claimed that 9/11 radicalized him, and he concluded religion must be eliminated. And if it's objected that 9/11 was a product of extreme religious fanaticism, the reply was that extreme religion grows from moderate religion, and so all religion has to go. However, it was eventually realized that it was very unwise to put jihadists and the Amish into the same category. Now, I come from Northern Ireland, and often it's used as an example of religious violence, and certainly my family suffered it. My father's business was bombed, my brother was nearly killed, and so I had to face this growing up. What do I think of this situation? Well, as a Christian, my first response is to say that Jesus Christ himself repudiated violence. And interestingly enough, he was himself tried for stirring up violence against the Roman authorities. And he was tried and he was acquitted by the Roman procurator Pilate. And I conclude from that those who take weapons to defend Christ and his message are not following him. They are disobeying him and so forfeit the right to be considered Christian. It is very important when we are considering this matter to see what Christ himself said and did. But apart from the suffering caused by religion, for which there's no excuse, of course, we need to ask the question, what about suffering caused by atheism? The famous song by John Lennon, the Beatle, called Imagine a world with no religion, and so on. But I'm not John Lennon, I'm John Lennox, and I've also written a song called Imagine. Imagine a world with no atheism, no Stalin, no Mao, no Pol Pot, just to name the heads of the 3 officially atheistic states that were responsible for some of the worst mass crimes of the 20th century. Just imagine a world with no gulag, no cultural revolution, no killing fields, no removal of children from their parents because the parents were teaching them about their religious beliefs, no refusal of higher education to believers in God, no discrimination against believers in the workplace, no pillaging, destruction, and burning of places of worship. Would that not be a world worth imagining too? John Gray, in his book Black Mass, makes the very important point that the role of the Enlightenment and 20th century terror remains a blind spot in Western perception. Libraries are stocked with books insisting that mass repression in Russia and China was a byproduct of traditions of despotism, with the implication that the communist ideology is innocent. Communist regimes, however, were established in pursuit of a utopian ideal whose origins lie in the heart of the Enlightenment, a byproduct of attempt to remake life. Pre-modern theocracies, says Gray, did not attempt to do this. Terror of the kind practiced by Lenin did not come from the Tsars. This is why the biblical understanding of what it means to be human is so important. I've often spoken with Russian intellectuals during my many visits there, some of them dissidents with impressive academic pedigrees, who said to me something like this: "We thought that we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. We were wrong. We destroyed both God and man." The reason for that is that atheism, taken to its logical conclusion, not only undermines rationality and science, it destroys all values. Richard Dawkins writes, "In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. This universe is precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is. And we dance to its music." Richard Dawkins wants us to imagine a supposed utopia without religion. But now let's imagine his world of blind genetic forces. In such a world where there's no evil and no good, we would have to say that the suicide bombers of 9/11 or the schoolboy who murdered half of the teachers in his school in Erfurt were simply dancing to the music of their DNA, as were the architects of the killing fields of Cambodia, Rwanda, and Sudan. How can anyone blame them for what they did, any more than one can blame a bee for stinging them? If there is no eternal base for values that is external to humanity, how can Dawkins, Hitchens, or anyone else's standards be anything but limited human conventions, ultimately meaningless products of a blind, unguided evolutionary process? Thus, far from delivering an adequate explanation for morality, this particular new atheistic acid dissolves morality into incoherence. John Gray wrote, "The new atheists defend liberal freedoms without asking where they come from. In fact, the new atheists are soft atheists. They wish to retain the freedoms of a liberal democracy and have their atheism at the same time. Real or hard atheists like Nietzsche, Camus, and Sartre would ask them how they can rationally justify their absolute standing commitment to timeless values without implicitly invoking God. The hard atheist would say that is impossible. It was Nietzsche who warned what would happen to the value of humanity within society if God was killed." In the words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, If I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to say men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. If I were called upon to identify briefly the principal trait of the entire 20th century, here too I would be unable to find anything more precise and pithy than to repeat once again, men have forgotten God. To the ill-considered hopes of the last 2 centuries, which have reduced us to insignificance and brought us to the brink of nuclear and non-nuclear death, we can propose only a determined quest for the warm hand of God, which we have so rashly and self-confidently spurned. Only in this way can our eyes be opened to the errors of this unfortunate 20th century, and our bands be directed to setting them right. There is nothing else to cling to in the landslide. The combined vision of all the thinkers of the Enlightenment amounts to nothing. And finally, it brings me to a very important issue. Is justice then a delusion? Dawkins not only denies the existence of good and evil, but there's another thing that doesn't exist in his world, and that is justice. He says there's no justice. So terrorists, human traffickers, child abusers are going to get away with it, are they? No, they are not, because Dawkins is wrong. And all of us have an inbuilt sense of good and evil that intuitively tells us that he is wrong. The Bible backs that up by telling us that there will be a final judgment. When the Christian apostle Paul addressed the philosophical court at Athens, he said, something that needs to be said today, that God has appointed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all men by raising him from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of Christianity, and with his death forms the key to our salvation, about which atheism knows nothing. Christianity explains why science works. It makes sense of morality and meaning. Hay mucho más decir sobre estos temas. Y si tienes saberlo, por favor, hay un libro, Disparando contra Dios. Muchísimas gracias. Adiós.